Welcome back. You are listening to the home of forbidden romances. Prepare yourself, because tonight's story will leave you breathless. The obsidian doors of the grand hall slammed open with a violence that shattered the intricate stained glass windows, sending a rain of colored shards down upon the trembling courtiers. "I told you," a voice growled, low and vibrating with a primal, tectonic power that forced every alpha in the room to their knees, "that if a single hair on his head was out of place, I would burn this kingdom to ash and salt the earth with your bones." The winter in the northern expanse was not merely a season. It was a living, breathing predator that swallowed hope whole. For Julian, a recessive omega struggling to keep a dilapidated cottage warm, the cold was a constant, biting enemy. The wind howled through the cracks in the timber walls, sounding like the ghosts of his past coming to collect the debts he could never repay. Julian pulled the threadbare wool blanket tighter around the small bundle in his arms. Leo, his 2-year-old son, slept fitfully, his small breaths puffing out like tiny clouds in the frigid air. Julian's fingers were raw and chapped, the skin broken from chopping wood and scrubbing floors in the village tavern. But his touch upon Leo's cheek was as soft as a falling snowflake. "Just a little longer, my love," Julian whispered, his voice cracking from disuse. "The thaw will come soon." It was a lie. The freeze was deepening. Julian placed Leo into the nest of blankets near the dying hearth and grabbed his cloak. He needed more wood. If the fire went out, they wouldn't survive the night. He stepped out into the blinding white, the snow crunching loudly under his worn boots. He hadn't walked 50 yards into the tree line when he saw it. At first, he thought it was a fallen boulder, a massive dark shape disrupting the pristine white of the forest floor. But as he drew closer, the metallic scent of copper hit him before the visual did. Blood. Hot, fresh blood melting the snow. It was a wolf. But to call it a wolf was an insult to the creature's majesty. It was gigantic, easily the size of a warhorse, with fur as black as a starless night. It lay on its side, a jagged spear shaft protruding from its flank, its breathing shallow and ragged. Julian froze. Common sense, the survival instinct that had kept him alive this long, screamed at him to run. This was a monster, a beast of the deep woods, could snap him in half with a single bite. But then the creature opened one eye. It was a glowing, molten gold, clouded with pain. It didn't look predatory. It looked resigned. Julian looked back at his cottage where Leo slept. If this beast died here, scavengers would come. Bears, lesser wolves, things that would smell the baby. "You picked a terrible place to die," Julian muttered, his heart hammering against his ribs. He shouldn't. He really shouldn't. But Julian was a healer before he was an outcast. He approached the beast slowly, hands raised. The wolf let out a low rumble, a warning vibration that shook the snow from the nearby branches. "I'm not going to hurt you," Julian said, his voice steady despite his fear. "But that spear needs to come out, or the infection will kill you before the blood loss does." He knelt beside the massive head. The wolf watched him, the golden eye tracking his movement. Julian reached out, expecting to lose a hand. Instead, the wolf closed its eyes and exhaled, a sound of surrender. For the next 3 days, the cottage was a cramped, tense infirmary. Julian had managed to drag the creature onto a sled and haul it into the attached woodshed, the only place large enough to house it. He used his last stores of alcohol to clean the wound, stitched the flesh with his sewing kit, and made poultices from dried herbs he had gathered in the autumn. The wolf, whom Julian secretly named Shadow, was a silent, brooding patient. It didn't shift. That was strange. Usually, shifters reverted to human form to heal. Julian suspected the spear had been poisoned with wolfsbane, locking the shifter in his feral form and dampening his cognitive abilities. "Here," Julian said on the 4th day, holding out a wooden bowl of broth. "It's not much, but it's warm." The wolf lifted its massive head and lapped at the broth. A small giggle erupted from the doorway. Julian spun around. Leo had toddled out of the main room, clutching his stuffed rabbit. "Puppy!" the toddler squealed, pointing at the monster that could swallow him whole. "Leo, no!" Julian lunged, grabbing his son. But the wolf didn't snarl. It didn't lunge. Instead, it lowered its head to the floor, ears flattening in a submissive gesture. It let out a soft woof sound, nudging the empty bowl toward the child. Leo wriggled in Julian's grip. "Puppy sad." Julian stared, his breath caught in his throat. The beast's golden eyes were fixed on Leo with an intensity that wasn't hunger. It was curiosity, perhaps even longing. Over the next week, a strange domestic rhythm formed. Julian would work, the wolf would rest, and Leo would fearlessly use the massive predator as a climbing gym. The wolf tolerated the toddler's antics with a patience that baffled Julian. When Leo cried at night from the cold, the wolf would endure the child curling up against his thick, warm fur. Julian found himself talking to the wolf. He spoke of his loneliness, of the alpha who had abandoned him when he found out Julian was pregnant, of the crushing weight of poverty. "I just want him to be safe," Julian whispered one evening, sitting by the wolf's flank while Leo slept between them. "I don't care what happens to me, but Leo, he deserves a kingdom. He deserves to never know what it feels like to be hungry." The wolf lifted its head, pressing its cold, wet nose against Julian's neck, right over his scent gland. It inhaled deeply, a gesture so intimate it made Julian flush. For a moment, he felt a phantom sensation, a heavy, protective aura wrapping around him, smelling of ozone and pine. Then, the morning came when Julian woke up to an empty woodshed. The door was unlatched. The snow outside showed heavy tracks leading into the forest, disappearing into the blizzard. There was no note, no goodbye, just a pile of dead pheasants left neatly by the doorstep, a payment. Julian felt a hollow ache in his chest that he couldn't explain. He told himself it was for the best. A wolf didn't belong in a cage. 6 months later, the snow had melted, revealing the mud and misery beneath. "Payment, Julian. Now." Baron Vane stood in the doorway of the cottage, blocking the spring sunlight. He was a greasy, rotund beta with a penchant for cruelty and a ledger that ruled the village. I don't have it yet," Julian stammered, shielding Leo behind his legs. "The harvest hasn't come in. Please, Vane. Another month." Vane sneered, stepping into the small room. His eyes raked over Julian, then settled on Leo. "Your debt has compounded. The interest alone is more than this hovel is worth. But there is a demand in the capital." Julian's blood ran cold. "What?" "The Alpha King is holding a grand selection," Vane said, a wicked glint in his eye. "He requires servants. Omegas, specifically those with resilience. I can sell your debt contract to the royal steward. You'll work off what you owe in the scullery." "And my son?" Julian asked, his voice trembling. "The child comes as part of the package." "Or," Vane shrugged, "I leave him at the orphanage." The orphanage in this district was a death sentence. Julian gripped Leo's shoulder so hard his knuckles turned white. "I'll go. We'll go." The journey to the capital, the Citadel of Silver, was a blur of misery. Packed into a carriage with other debtors, Julian held Leo close, whispering stories of knights and dragons to keep the boy calm. When they arrived, the citadel was overwhelming. Towers of glass and white stone pierced the clouds. The air smelled of expensive spices and raw power. They were herded like cattle into the service quarters, stripped, scrubbed, and dressed in the uniform of the lowest caste of servants. Rough gray tunics. Julian kept his head down. Do the work. Feed Leo. Survive. But fate, it seemed, had a cruel sense of humor. It was the day of the high banquet. The Alpha King, Kalen Valeries, known as the Wolf King for his brutality in war and his icy demeanor in court, was celebrating the anniversary of his coronation. The palace was in chaos. Julian was assigned to carry heavy platters of roasted meats to the main hall. He had no choice but to bring Leo with him, hiding the toddler behind a tapestry in the servants' alcove with strict instructions to stay quiet. The grand hall was a sea of velvet and jewels. At the far end sat the king. Julian dared a single glance. King Cailan was terrifyingly beautiful. He had hair as dark as the void and eyes of molten gold, eyes that looked hauntingly familiar. He sat on the throne with a bored, lethal grace, ignoring the fawning omegas and scheming nobles vying for his attention. "More wine!" a drunk duke shouted, shoving his goblet at Julian as he passed. Julian stumbled, the heavy platter slipping from his grasp. It crashed to the marble floor, gravy and meat splattering onto the duke's pristine silk shoes. The music stopped. The hall went deathly silent. "You clumsy filth!" the duke roared, his face turning purple. He raised a heavy, ring-adorned hand and backhanded Julian across the face. Julian fell hard, tasting blood. He didn't cry out. He curled in on himself, expecting the boots to follow. "Dada!" The scream shattered the tension. Leo, terrified by the violence, ran from his hiding spot, his small legs pumping as he threw himself over Julian's prone body. "No hit, Dada. Bad man." The duke looked at the child, disgusted. "A brat? You brought a brat into the royal hall." He raised his hand again, this time aiming for the toddler. "I'll teach you to breed in the gutter." Julian scrambled to cover Leo, squeezing his eyes shut, waiting for the blow. It never came. A sound ripped through the air. A growl so deep it vibrated in the marrow of everyone present. It wasn't human. It was the sound of a predator whose territory had been breached. Boom. The throne room doors didn't just open. The pressure in the room exploded. King Cailan was standing. The wine glass in his hand had turned to dust. His golden eyes were no longer bored. They were glowing, the pupils blown wide into vertical slits. He was looking directly at the center of the room. Julian. Or rather, he was smelling them. The king moved. It was a blur of motion too fast for the human eye to track. 1 second he was on the dais. The next, he was standing between the duke and Julian. The duke froze, his hands still raised in the air. Your Majesty." This servant. Cailan didn't even look at the duke. His gaze was fixed on the small, trembling boy clutching Julian's tunic. The king's nostrils flared. "Winterberries?" Cailan whispered, his voice hoarse. "And milk." It was Julian's scent. The scent that had kept the wolf sane in the darkness of his poisoned fever. The duke, realizing he was being ignored, made the fatal mistake of trying to regain control. "Sire, I will handle this trash. They have ruined the—" He reached out to grab Leo's arm to toss him aside. Snap. The sound of the duke's wrist breaking was louder than the music had been. The duke screamed, falling to his knees. Cailan didn't let go of the shattered wrist. He twisted it further, his face a mask of absolute, unadulterated fury. "You touched him," the king snarled. "You dared to raise a hand against what is mine." The court gasped. "Mine?" Julian looked up, blood trickling from his lip, his eyes meeting the king's. The recognition was instant. The scar on the king's neck, barely visible under the royal collar. It was where Julian had stitched the spear wound. "Shadow," Julian breathed. Cailan dropped the weeping duke and fell to his knees. Not in weakness, but in worship. He ignored the hundreds of watching nobles. He reached out, his large, calloused hands trembling slightly as they hovered over Julian's bruised cheek. "I looked for you," Cailan rasped, the roughness of the wolf mixing with the articulation of the king. "I tore the north apart looking for the scent of winterberries. I thought the snow had taken you." Leo, realizing the danger had passed, looked at the terrifying king. The toddler sniffed, then his eyes widened. He pointed a chubby finger at Cailan's chest. "Puppy!" The court went dead silent. Calling the Wolf King puppy was grounds for execution. But Cailan didn't rage. A look of profound agony and relief washed over his sharp features. He lowered his head, pressing his forehead against Leo's small chest, inhaling deeply. "Yes," the king whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "Puppy is here." Kalen looked up at Julian, his eyes burning with a possessiveness that made the air feel heavy. Who did this to you? Who put you in these rags? Debts? Julian whispered, still in shock. I didn't know. Kalen stood up, scooping Leo into one arm and pulling Julian up with the other. He turned to the room, his aura flaring out, crushing the will of every alpha present. The shadows in the room seemed to lengthen, twisting into the shapes of wolves. From this moment forth, Kalen announced, his voice carrying to the rafters, Julian is your queen, and this child. He looked down at Leo, who was currently tugging on the royal braids. This child is the crown prince. He is my heir. My blood or not, he is of my pack. He turned his gaze to the guards. Take the duke to the dungeons, and find the man who held my mate's debt. I want his head on a pike by sunrise. Kalen, Julian started. You don't have to. I do, Kalen interrupted, pulling Julian into his chest. Burying his face in the crook of Julian's neck, he scented him openly, claiming him before the entire empire. You saved me when I was nothing but a dying beast. You fed me when you had nothing. You kept my cub warm. He pulled back just enough to look into Julian's eyes. I am a wolf, Julian. We mate for life. You are my soul. And no one, he looked around the room, a feral growl underlining his words, will ever touch my baby or my mate again. Julian leaned into the touch, the exhaustion of the last few years finally bleeding out of him. He wasn't alone in the cold anymore. Let's go home, Kalen murmured, lifting Julian into his arms as easily as if he were made of feathers. Leo sandwiched happily between them. As the king carried them out of the hall, leaving a stunned court in his wake, Julian rested his head on the shoulder of the man who had once been a monster in the snow, knowing that the real monsters would never reach them again. And that is how the Wolf King found his heart in the dead of winter. If you enjoyed seeing the Wolf King destroy his enemies to protect his family, smash that like button. And tell me in the comments, would you have saved the wounded wolf, or let nature take its course? I'll be reading your answers. Subscribe for the next chapter. Until then,